dramatic Victorian horror mystery. The dead do not arrive on schedule, and yet here they are. London, 1888. Prologue, Fog and Silence. London breathed in the winter of 1888 the way a dying man breathes, in long, wet rattles that shook the fog loose from the Thames and pushed it through the cobblestone arteries of Whitechapel like something alive and searching. The gaslit lamps along Commercial Street had long given up trying to hold back the dark. They burned amber and faint, little halos of amber smeared across the murk, and beneath them the city moved hunched figures in long coats, costermongers pushing barrows of unsold fish, women clutching shawls to their throats, children running messages for pennies. London never slept, it only dimmed. It was in this dimming that the rumors first began to circulate, whispered between the night porters at Fenchurch Street Station, muttered over warm gin at the 10 Bells on Commercial Street, scrawled in cramped handwriting across the pages of certain private journals that would never be submitted to any newspaper. The rumors were these, that somewhere beneath the streets of Whitechapel, in a tunnel that appeared on no official survey and no railway map, a train arrived every night at exactly 12 minutes past midnight. It arrived silently, or nearly so. It departed before anyone could board. And the passengers it delivered, those pale, trembling souls who stumbled up through the forgotten stations, exits into the cold London air, could not explain where they had been, how long they had traveled, or why their eyes carried the particular look of people who had witnessed something vast and terrible, and completely beyond their power to describe. Nobody reported these passengers to Scotland Yard. Nobody printed a word about them in the Times or the Illustrated Police News. The City of London had enough ghosts of its own in those dark months. There were other matters to attend to. There were murders to solve or not to solve, as was increasingly becoming the case. There was a name being carved into the consciousness of a terrified city. Jack, just Jack, Jack the Ripper. Edmund Blackwood had not believed the rumors. He had trained himself in 17 years of detective work to disbelieve rumors as a matter of professional principle. Rumors were the sediment of fear, the stories that fear told itself to explain the inexplicable. Edmund dealt in facts, in footprints and tobacco ash and the particular angle at which a candle had dripped. He dealt in the silence of crime scenes and the surprising loudness of what they revealed. He did not believe in ghost trains. He would. Chapter 1. The Train AT-1207. It was his insomnia that brought him there first. Edmund Blackwood had not slept through a full night in 11 months, not since the evening he had stood in a narrow court off Dorset Street and stared at what remained of Mary Jane Kelly, the last confirmed victim of the Ripper, and understood with terrible clarity that he had failed, that they had all failed. He had been the senior detective assigned to coordinate the Metropolitan Police's response to the Whitechapel murders for 6 months. In that time, 5 women had died with surgical precision, and the killer had vanished as completely as morning fog burns away under the sun, as if he had never existed at all, leaving behind only the shadow of what he had done. Scotland Yard had quietly reassigned Edmund to other matters. He had quietly resigned. That had been 3 months ago. Now he existed in the narrow rooms he rented on Lemon Street, surrounded by newspapers and case files and the particular clutter of a man who cannot stop working on a problem that has officially been closed. He walked the streets of Whitechapel at night because the streets were the only place his mind quieted enough to think, and he thought best in the cold, in the fog, moving. On the night of the 14th of February, 1889, he had walked further than he intended. The fog was exceptionally thick, a proper London particular, the kind that tasted of coal and river mud and left a fine dark residue on a man's collar. He had walked south from Lemon Street toward the railway district, his thoughts circling as always around the Ripper case, when he noticed an iron door set into the brick foundation of a railway viaduct arch. The door was old. The hinges were orange with rust that looked ancient. A chain hung across it, but the padlock, Edmund noticed, had been shorn clean through, Recently, the metal bright and raw at the cut. He descended. The steps were stone and steep, and the gas lamp he had brought, he always carried one after dark these days, cast its small circle of yellow light down the stairwell. The air was immediately different below the street, colder, heavier, with the particular damp mineral smell of underground London, the smell of buried rivers and old stone and centuries of the city pressing down from above. The platform he found at the bottom could not have been less than 40 feet below street level. It was longer than it had any right to be, stretching away into darkness at both ends. The tiles on the walls were cream and deep burgundy, in the style of the Underground Railway's earlier stations, and though they were grimy and many were cracked, they retained a ghostly elegance. Iron benches ran along the platform wall. A sign hung above them, its paint so faded that Edmund had to hold his lamp close to read it. Whitechapel Cross, Underground City and South London Railway. He had never heard of the Underground City and South London Railway. He made a mental note to check the railway directories. He checked his pocket watch. It read 11:51 in the evening. He sat on one of the iron benches and waited, though he could not have said precisely what he was waiting for. The silence was extraordinary. Even through 40 feet of earth and brick and centuries of London, he would have expected to hear something, the distant grumble of a late omnibus, the bark of a dog, the far-off toll of a church clock. There was nothing. The silence pressed against his eardrums like deep water. At precisely 12 minutes past midnight, he marked it on his watch. A reflex, he heard it. It began as a vibration felt rather than heard, a trembling in the stone beneath his boots that made the small hairs on his forearms rise through his coat and shirt. Then sound arrived, the low, mournful wail of a steam whistle, far away and growing, the rhythmic thunder of pistons, the iron screech of wheel on rail. Edmund stood. He moved to the edge of the platform and held his lamp out over the darkness of the tunnel mouth. The train emerged from the right-hand tunnel. It was black. Not the ordinary grime-darkened black of working railway engines, but a deep, absolute black, the black of coal seams and midnight water and the spaces between stars. Its carriages were Victorian in design, the older style with individual compartments and external running boards, and every window was lit from within by a faint, wavering light the color of a guttered candle. The engine produced no visible steam. It arrived without smoke, without the usual billowing exhalations of a working locomotive, and it moved in near silence, or in a silence that felt near, compared to the roar Edmund had expected, the silence of something that had been traveling for a very long time and had grown quieter with the distance. It stopped. The doors opened. They came out one by one, emerging from the compartments onto the narrow platform with the careful movements of people who are not entirely certain their legs will support them. Edmund counted 7. 3 women, 4 men, ranging in apparent age from perhaps 20 to perhaps 60. Their clothing was Victorian, good Victorian, middle class, the women in dark wool skirts and fitted bodices, the men in frock coats and tall hats. But the clothing was wrong in ways Edmund could not immediately articulate. The cut was slightly off. The materials looked simultaneously too fine and too worn. One of the men wore a waistcoat that Edmund had not seen the like of since visiting his grandfather as a boy. They stood on the platform, blinking in the light of his lamp, and none of them spoke. Edmund took a step toward the nearest passenger, a man of perhaps 50 with gray side whiskers and a dazed expression. "Sir," he said, "can you hear me? Do you know where you are?" The man turned his head slowly as if waking from a deep sleep. His eyes found Edmund's face and something in them seemed to organize itself, to gather and focus. "I was on my way home," the man said, with the confused reasonableness of a person beginning to doubt their own certainty. "I was on the 7:15 from Cannon Street. I sat down in a second-class carriage and He paused. He looked at his hands. "I am not certain what happened next." "How long were you on the train?" Edmund asked. The man frowned deeply. "It felt," he stopped. He seemed to be searching for a word that did not exist in ordinary English. "It felt like a very long time," he said at last. "A very long time, but also not very long at all." Edmund turned to look at the train. It sat on the rails, patient and black and silent. Through the compartment windows, he could see the pale oblongs of faces, more passengers, still seated, staring out at the platform with wide, frightened eyes and no apparent intention of disembarking. Edmund reached into his coat for his notebook. He had 17 years of instinct behind him, and every one of those years was telling him the same thing. This is a scene of crime. He did not know yet what crime, or against whom, or by what means. But he knew the particular quality of wrongness in the air as surely as he knew his own name. He began to write. The train was gone by midnight. It did not depart dramatically. There was no whistle, no gathering of steam, no lurch of carriages. One moment it was there. Edmund looked up from his notebook to ask one of the passengers a question, and when he looked back at the tracks, the train was gone. The rails were empty. The tunnel mouth was dark. 7 passengers remained on the platform. When Edmund eventually guided them up the stone stairs and into the Whitechapel night, 3 of them were unable to give their names. One of the women walked directly to the curb of Commercial Street, sat down on the wet cobblestones, and wept without sound for a very long time, and Edmund sat with her because he did not know what else to do. He returned to Lemon Street in the small hours of the morning with his notebook full of questions and 0 answers, and he lay on his narrow bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling with sleep nowhere near him and thought, "I am going to get to the bottom of this, or I am going to lose my mind trying." Neither outcome at that particular moment seemed entirely unwelcome. Chapter 2. The Woman Without a Name. He returned the following evening with better preparation. He had spent the day in research, at the British Library reading room, where the railway company directories confirmed there was no registered entity called the Underground City and South London Railway, then at the General Register Office on St. Catherine's House, where the 3 passengers he had identified by name turned out to be a puzzle of an altogether different order. One was listed in the death register. He had died, according to the official record, in the spring of 1886, 3 years before Edmund had stood on the platform and watched him walk, confused but physically present, up a flight of stone steps and into Commercial Street. The second name he had managed to record was that of a woman, a Mrs. Harriet Voss of Clerkenwell, who appeared in the missing persons records compiled after a domestic fire in 1883 had killed several members of her household. She had been presumed dead in the fire. She had, as far as official London was concerned, ceased to exist 6 years ago. Edmund sat in his rooms with these facts arrayed before him like the pieces of a puzzle whose picture he could not yet see, and he felt the particular cold that comes not from temperature, but from the proximity of something that should be impossible. That night he descended again at 11:30 and waited. The train arrived as before at 12 minutes past midnight exactly. Edmund had brought his watch, a reliable Waltham pocket repeater, and he checked it 3 times as the vibration built and the black engine emerged from its tunnel. 12:07, each time, as precise as a clock's own second hand. This night there were 9 passengers. Edmund moved quickly along the platform as they disembarked, studying faces, noting distinguishing details in his book, speaking quietly to those who could speak. Most were in the same condition as the night before, disoriented, frightened, unable to clearly articulate what they had experienced. One man kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "We were stopped. We were just stopped for so long, in the dark." It was the last passenger to emerge from the final carriage, who arrested Edmund's attention entirely. She was young, 25, he guessed, perhaps younger. She wore a dark gray traveling dress of a style that Edmund associated with the early part of the decade, a small hat with a black veil that she had pushed back from her face, and she carried a large rectangular suitcase of brown leather, much battered, with tarnished brass catches. What stopped Edmund was not her clothing or her age but her expression. While every other passenger on the platform wore some version of confusion or fear, this woman's face was arranged in an expression that Edmund, after a moment's study, could only characterize as watchful. She was looking at the platform, at the walls, at the faded station sign, with the focused attention of someone conducting a deliberate inspection. She was not confused. She was, if Edmund was reading her correctly, afraid, but the fear was the contained, purposeful fear of someone who had expected to be afraid and had prepared for it. "Good evening," Edmund said to her. She looked at him. Her eyes were very dark gray, the color of the Thames in winter, and they assessed him with a directness that was unusual in his experience in women of her apparent social class and generation. "Good evening," she replied. Her voice was low and clear. "You are not from the train." "No, my name is Edmund Blackwood. I was a detective. I've been observing the arrivals." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "How many nights?" "This is my second, miss." She shook her head, not rudely but definitely. "I find I am not certain of my name at present. I believe I had one." "Then I will call you miss." Edmund paused. He thought of the gray of her eyes, the particular quality of the fog that hung around her like a garment she had chosen. "Gray," he said. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, "if you like." He offered to carry her suitcase. She declined. He offered to escort her from the station. She accepted this, but on the condition that they speak further. They climbed the stone stairs into the Whitechapel night, and she moved through the fog with a sureness that suggested either local knowledge or an exceptionally good sense of direction, and Edmund walked beside her and asked careful questions, and she answered some of them and not others. She did not know how she had come to be on the train. She remembered standing on an ordinary railway platform in the ordinary way, and the ordinary darkness of a tunnel arriving, and then a very long time that she could not account for, and then the station below, and the detective with his lamp, and here they were. She remembered certain things very clearly: the cold on the train, the silence, the faces of the other passengers pale as paper in the dark compartments, and one other thing. Edmund noticed her tightening her grip on the handle of the suitcase. "What is in the case, Miss Gray?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she set it down on the pavement under a gas lamp and undid the tarnished brass catches with practiced fingers and lifted the lid. Inside the suitcase, packed in careful layers like archaeological strata, were newspapers. Edmund crouched and held his lamp close. They were the Times, the Star, the Evening Standard, the Illustrated Police News. He read the dates: 1887, 1886, 1885. And beneath them, as he carefully lifted the upper layers, older still: 1883, 1881, 1879, and the headlines repeated across the layers, obsessively collected and preserved. Whitechapel terror, another dreadful murder. The fiend of East London. Who is Jack the Ripper? Police baffled. More women missing from Whitechapel. He looked up at her. She was watching him with the same careful, contained expression. "These papers go back years before the Ripper murders were publicly known," Edmund said. "The earliest murders in this pile are from 1879. There was no Jack the Ripper in 1879. The name didn't appear in print until—" 1888, she said. "I know, but the killings were happening. There were women disappearing from Whitechapel long before the newspapers gave it a name." She paused. "I was collecting evidence. I had been collecting evidence for—" Another pause, longer this time, with a look of genuine distress crossing her features. "I am not certain how long. It feels like a very long time. Years, perhaps. I cannot be precise." Edmund looked again at the newspapers, at the careful chronological layering, at what appeared to be handwritten annotations in the margins of some of the pages. Dates, initials, locations, in small neat writing he could not read by lamplight. Someone had been building a case. "Someone sent you," he said, not a question. Her gray eyes met his. "Or someone is sending me," she said. "I am not entirely certain the verb should be past tense." Edmund stood. He closed the suitcase. He handed it back to her, and she took it without comment, and they walked on through the London fog, and Edmund turned what she had said over in his mind like a stone with something living beneath it, and he thought, the past tense. What does it mean for someone to be uncertain about their own past tense? He thought he was beginning to understand something. He was not sure he wanted to. Chapter 3. The Forgotten Platform. In the morning, after a few fitful hours of something approximating sleep, Edmund went to the map room at the British Museum. It was one of his favorite places in London, the great domed reading room's cartographic annex, where the city's history was laid out in paper and ink across 2 centuries of surveying and ray drawing. He had used it often during the Ripper investigation to trace the geography of the murders, to understand the relationship between the women's homes and their places of work and the spaces in between where they had become vulnerable. He knew the room well, and he knew what it contained. He did not know, until he began to look, what it did not contain. There were maps of the London Underground Railway from every decade of its existence, from the original 1863 Metropolitan Railway through the subsequent expansions, the District, the Circle, the various branch lines threading outward into the suburbs. Edmund had a reasonable working knowledge of the network from his years of using it. He knew the major stations and the routes between them. He could not, in any map printed after approximately 1871, find any reference to Whitechapel Cross Station, nor to the Underground City and South London Railway that the faded sign in the tunnel had named. In maps printed before 1871, however, the story was different. He found it first in an 1868 survey of proposed underground railway extensions. The Underground City and South London Railway was listed as a private concern, incorporated in 1865, with proposed lines connecting several of the deeper parts of the East End to the main underground system, then being constructed. It appeared in a supplementary survey from 1869, with the notation that preliminary tunneling had begun. And then, in an 1871 official survey of the Underground Railway network, it was simply gone. The tunnels were not listed, the company was not mentioned, and the space where Whitechapel Cross would have sat in the network was occupied by blank paper. As if someone had reached into the official record and simply removed it. Edmund spent 3 hours in the map room and left with more questions than answers and a growing conviction that whatever had happened to the Underground City and South London Railway, whatever had happened to Whitechapel Cross Station, it had not been an ordinary cessation of business. Companies did not simply disappear from official surveys. Tunnels did not stop existing because a company stopped trading. Something had been deliberately erased. He also found, in a bundle of miscellaneous railway correspondence from 1871 that had been misfiled under proposed extensions abandoned, a single letter. It was from the Metropolitan Board of Works to a solicitor firm acting on behalf of the Underground City and South London Railway, and it informed the recipients, in the careful language of official bureaucracy, that the board had determined to exercise its powers of compulsory acquisition over the disputed tunnels and station works, and that all records relating to the company's operations were to be submitted to the board forthwith for examination, and the word struck Edmund's eye with force. Sequestration. Sequestration, not preservation, sequestration. The letter was dated the 4th of March, 1871. In the space designated for the addressee's written acknowledgement, there was a note in different handwriting, cramped and agitated. They mean to bury it. They mean to bury everything. God help the poor souls left behind. Edmund folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He was aware that he was removing it without permission from a public archive, which was not, strictly speaking, legal. He was also aware that this was the sort of concern that felt very small compared to the size of what was beginning to take shape in his mind. He descended again that night and the night after and the night after that. Each time the train arrived at 12:07. Each time passengers emerged bewildered, frightened, wearing clothes from different decades, speaking of long dark journeys they could not map or explain. He interviewed them all patiently and carefully, with the skills that 17 years of detective work had honed to a fine edge. He built up a picture. The passengers shared certain experiences in common. They had all been on ordinary trains on ordinary evenings and had entered tunnels that did not end when they should have. They had all spent what felt like a very long time in darkness, with the train stopped or moving so slowly as to be imperceptible. They had all heard, at various points during their ordeal, other voices, other passengers in other compartments, whispering or crying or occasionally singing, with a quality to the sound that several of them described independently as like hearing someone in a room below you through a wooden floor. Present but unreachable. And every one of them, when Edmund asked them what was the last clear thing they remembered before the tunnel, named a date that was not 1889. They named 1882 or 1876 or 1884. They named years that were years ago, and they named them with the certainty of people recalling yesterday. Edmund stood on the empty platform after the train had departed on the fifth night and looked at the clock on the far wall. It was a large clock, iron-framed and ornate in the Victorian railway style, and it had been ticking, unchanged, at 12:07 since the first night he had arrived. He had assumed it was stopped, a broken clock, frozen at a random hour. He was no longer certain it was random. Chapter 4. The Man in the Black Coat. Edmund first saw him on the sixth night. He had developed a habit of arriving at the station entrance, the iron door in the railway arch, by 11 o'clock, giving himself an hour on the platform before the train's arrival. He found the time useful for thinking, and the underground silence which had initially unnerved him had become strangely conducive to clarity. There was no London up here, no costermongers, no footsteps, no distant bells. Just the cold mineral air and the old tiles and the light of his lamp, and he could think without interruption. On the sixth night, he arrived at the arch at 10 minutes to 11 to find the gate above, the heavy iron door, standing open. He had closed and locked it behind him the previous night. He was certain of this. He descended with more caution than usual, one hand on the rough brick of the stairwell wall, lamp held low so as not to advertise himself to anyone who might be on the platform below. He found the platform empty. He made a careful circuit of both ends of the platform, checking the tunnel mouths and the two small side corridors that he had previously explored, both of which led to locked iron doors beyond which he had not yet penetrated. Everything was as he had left it. He was sitting on the bench near the clock at 11:30 when he became aware that he was being observed. The sensation was not unfamiliar to him. In 17 years of detective work, he had spent considerable time in the company of people who wished him harm, and had developed a sensitivity to being watched that was more physiological than intellectual, a tightening across the shoulder blades, a change in the quality of the silence. He sat very still and allowed his eyes to move without moving his head. At the far end of the platform, where the light from his lamp reached its furthest extent and began to lose the argument with the dark, there was a figure. It was tall, very tall, well over 6 feet. It wore a long black coat that fell to its ankles and a tall hat of the style Edmund associated with the 1860s and 1870s rather than the present decade. The brim of the hat was pulled low. The collar of the coat was turned up. Between brim and collar, Edmund could make out almost nothing, a pallor that might have been a face, a suggestion of features. The figure stood completely still, in the particular stillness of something that has been standing in one place for a very long time. Edmund stood. He moved toward the figure, keeping his pace measured and his lamp steady. The figure did not move. Edmund walked the length of the platform. The figure remained motionless. The darkness around it seemed thicker than ordinary darkness, not a trick of the light, but something present in its own right. The way smoke is present and fog is present, something with body and purpose. Edmund was 15 feet away when the lamp, which had been burning steadily all evening, guttered violently and nearly went out. He stopped. When the lamp steadied, the figure was gone. Edmund stood in the empty end of the platform and felt the cold pressing in from both tunnel mouths simultaneously, and for the first time since he had begun this investigation, he felt something that he recognized, reluctantly, as genuine fear. Not the professional alertness of a detective in a potentially dangerous situation, not the contained apprehension of approaching an unknown. Something older and more primitive, the fear of the thing that stands just outside the edge of the firelight and will not come closer and will not go away. He turned his lamp up as high as it would go and sat back down on the bench and waited for the train. Over the following nights, the figure appeared 3 more times, always at the far end of the platform, always at approximately the same time, between 11:30 and 11:45, before the train's arrival, always in the long black coat and the tall hat, always still, always disappearing when Edmund moved toward it or when the train's approach began to vibrate through the stone beneath his boots. He made inquiries, cautious, oblique inquiries, the kind that did not require explaining what he had seen to people he needed to keep trusting him. He spoke to the night porters at the above-ground Whitechapel station, to the elderly railway employee he had found through one of the passengers who seemed to have some institutional memory of the area's railway history. He described the figure in general terms, a very tall man in old-fashioned dress who moved through the railway district at night. The railway man, who was 73 and had worked in the Whitechapel area since the 1850s, went very still when Edmund described the coat and the hat. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a story about a man like that. Been told in the railway district since before I was working here, a figure that walks the old tunnel routes." He paused. "We called him the inspector. We don't know why. Nobody does. He's been in the stories since the 1870s at least." "What happens in the stories?" Edmund asked. The old man looked at him sideways. "People who follow him," he said carefully, "don't generally come back to tell about it. In the stories." He emphasized the last 3 words in a way that suggested he was not entirely certain the qualifier was necessary. Edmund thanked him and left, and on his way back to Lemon Street, he passed the narrow court off Bucks Row where Polly Nichols had been killed, and he thought about the Ripper and the black-coated figure and the train that arrived at 12:07, and he thought about how things that appear unconnected often are not, and he thought about patterns, which were what he had always been best at finding. He thought he could see the edge of a pattern beginning to form. He could not yet see its shape. He could see only that it was large, much larger than he had initially supposed, and that it had been here in Whitechapel for a very long time. Chapter 5. Voices from the Empty Carriage. On the 12th night of his vigil, Edmund Blackwood boarded the train. He had planned it carefully in the methodical way he planned everything. He had positioned himself at the far end of the platform in the shadows cast by a dead lamp fitting, and when the passengers disembarked, 11 of them that night, he counted from his vantage point. He waited until the last of them had stepped onto the platform. The doors remained open. This had always been the pattern. Doors open, passengers out, a pause of perhaps 3 minutes, then closure. In those 3 minutes, nobody had ever re-entered a carriage. Nobody had ever tried. Edmund tried. He crossed the platform quickly, found a compartment door that had been vacated by a woman who had stumbled out wide-eyed and weeping, and stepped inside. The interior of the carriage was lit by small gas lamps in ornate brackets, though there was no apparent gas line, and the lamps produced not the ordinary warm gold of burning gas, but a thin, pale light the color of old ivory. The seats were upholstered in dark red plush, deeply worn in places, and the wooden paneling above them was carved with a repeating decorative pattern of, Edmund looked more closely, ravens and clock faces. He had not expected the decorative detail. The attention to the ordinary particulars of Victorian railway comfort, in something so thoroughly wrong, was deeply unsettling. He sat, the door behind him closed. He did not hear the doors close. He simply became aware, at some point after he had sat down, that the compartment was sealed. The platform outside the window had not changed, the same dim light, the same empty benches, the same faded station sign. But the glass between him and it now felt very far away, the way glass feels when you are looking through it at a picture rather than through a window at a real space. Then the train moved. The motion was unlike ordinary train motion. There was no jerk, no gradual gathering of speed. One moment the platform was outside the window, the next it was not. The window showed darkness, the darkness of a tunnel, but a darkness of a different quality from ordinary tunnel darkness. It was not the absence of light. It was the presence of something, a thick, mineral darkness that pressed against the glass from outside and seemed almost sentient in its density. Edmund sat very still and made himself breathe steadily and thought about what he knew. He heard them before he saw them. Voices, coming from the other compartments from both directions along the train, filtering through the wooden walls between the compartments with exactly the muffled quality that the passengers had described, present but unreachable, like sound through a floor. Some were crying. Some were speaking in normal tones, as if conducting ordinary conversations. Some were singing hymns, Edmund thought, and then identified one melody as something older, something he associated with his childhood nurse, a Scottish woman who had sung it. He could not remember the words. He remembered only that it had something to do with the sea and with coming home. He pressed his hands flat on his thighs and did not move. After a time, he could not have said how long, as his watch had stopped, and the pale lamps in the brackets seemed to alter the quality of time itself in the compartment, stretching it at the edges. A face appeared on the other side of the glass partition between his compartment and the next. It was a man's face, middle-aged, with a heavy mustache and the sort of side whiskers that had been fashionable in the 1860s. He was looking directly at Edmund with an expression of what Edmund could only characterize as terrible, exhausted recognition. The expression of a man who has been waiting to be found for a very long time and has not entirely stopped believing it would happen. Edmund knocked on the glass partition. The man's lips moved. Edmund could hear nothing through the glass. He watched the man's lips and tried to read them. He had some training in lip reading from his Scotland Yard days. It was occasionally useful in courtrooms. He watched the repeated movement of the man's mouth and he read, or thought he read, "The station. The station is where it began. He knows the station. He has always been here." "Who?" Edmund said aloud, and immediately felt slightly ridiculous, speaking alone in a sealed train carriage in a tunnel somewhere beneath London that he could not locate on any map. He mouthed the word through the glass. "Who?" The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he pressed his hand flat against the glass partition as if attempting to reach through it. Edmund watched his lips move again. "The man in the coat. The inspector. He was here before the train. He will be here after." Edmund felt the train beginning to slow. Or perhaps the darkness outside was beginning to change, lightening, thinning. He pulled out his notebook and wrote quickly, "Inspector, here before the train. He will be here after." The platform appeared outside the window. The doors opened. Edmund stood. He looked back at the glass partition. The man on the other side was gone. The compartment beyond the glass was empty. Edmund stepped onto the platform. The other passengers were gathered in their usual bewildered cluster near the benches. He counted them. He was the only one who had boarded. He checked his notebook. The writing he had done inside the carriage was there, the words he had set down. He found this more reassuring than he could entirely explain. He needed proof that it had happened. The notebook was proof. He looked at the clock on the wall. It read 12:07. He thought it always reads 12:07. Has it ever not read 12:07? And if not, what is 12:07? What is the significance of that precise moment? He thought the man said the station is where it began. He meant something. He meant something specific. He thought, I need to know what happened here. Not now. Not in 1889. Earlier. I need to know what this station is, what it was, what happened inside it to make a clock stop at 12 minutes past midnight. He turned to the nearest passenger, a young woman who had arrived with a small carpet bag, and the particular haunted look he was beginning to recognize as the expression of someone who had just spent an indeterminate period in a train that was not going anywhere in any direction that could be named. And he gave her his card, and told her he would arrange for a cab to take her wherever she needed to go. And he thought about the face at the glass partition, the mouth forming words, the hand pressed flat against a barrier that could not be broken by pressing. He thought, there are people on that train who cannot get off. There have been people on that train unable to get off for a very long time. The question was why? The answer, he was beginning to believe, lay in 1871, in the year the station had disappeared from the maps, in whatever event had frozen the clock at 12:07 and sent the Metropolitan Board of Works to sequester all the records. He would find that answer. He had found answers to things considerably more resistant to revelation than this. He walked up the stone stairs and into the London fog, and he did not look back at the figure he was reasonably certain was standing at the far end of the platform, watching him go. Chapter 6. Whitechapel's Hidden Secret. The sequestered documents were not, as it turned out, entirely inaccessible. They were merely buried. Edmund had spent 11 years of his career navigating the bureaucratic sediment of official London, and he knew that documents which were sequestered rather than destroyed were sequestered, because someone had balked at destruction, either from an excess of institutional caution or from a personal conviction that the records might someday be needed. The Metropolitan Board of Works had been dissolved in 1889, and its functions transferred to the newly created London County Council. And in the chaos of that bureaucratic transition, various repositories of older records had been reorganized with the thoroughness of a man clearing a desk, by pushing everything to one side and calling it done. He found the documents in a basement storage room of a building on Spring Gardens that had previously housed a Board of Works administrative office and now housed a county council subdepartment concerned with drainage maintenance. The room's contents had been catalogued in 1890 by a junior clerk who had listed them as Railway Miscellany, pre-1880, not yet reviewed, which was as good as invisible. He spent 2 full days in that basement room, reading by lamplight, eating nothing, occasionally standing to stretch his back against the protest of long hours bent over paper. What he found reshaped everything. The underground city and South London Railway had been, as he had known, a private concern incorporated in 1865. What he had not known was the specific nature of its original purpose. The company's founding prospectus, written in the careful, optimistic language of Victorian commercial enterprise, described a service that would operate outside the regular timetable of the main underground network, running late-night trains through the East End for the use of shift workers, night porters, police constables on late duty, and such other members of the laboring and professional classes as have occasion to travel through the district after the cessation of ordinary services. This was ordinary enough. It was what followed in the records that was not. In 1871, at the height of what the documents referred to obliquely as the Whitechapel disturbances, a phrase Edmund cross-referenced against his knowledge of the period, and identified as referring to a series of murders in the East End that had received limited press coverage, 5 years before the Ripper killings that the public knew. The railway had been approached by an agent of the Metropolitan Police. The agent had requested the use of Whitechapel Cross Station for the secure accommodation and transport of material witnesses to the disturbances, whose identities and movements it is thought advisable to keep from general knowledge. Edmund read this sentence 3 times. Then he read the response from the railway company's board, approval granted, with conditions relating to compensation and the provision of additional staff. Material witnesses. He understood what that meant. In 1871, in the early months of what would become, under different circumstances and different scale, a precursor to the Ripper murders, the Metropolitan Police had used Whitechapel Cross Station to transport witnesses, women who had seen things, men who knew things in secret, away from Whitechapel, away from whoever or whatever was operating in the area. The transportation of witnesses. The use of a station that did not officially exist, on a railway that did not officially exist, to move people who might be in danger if their movements were known. He read on. In October of 1871, there had been an incident. The records described it in the same careful, oblique language, with the maddening bureaucratic instinct for euphemism. An unfortunate occurrence at Whitechapel Cross Station on the evening of the 14th of October, resulting in casualties among the transported persons and a necessary cessation of the service. What had happened? Reading between the official lines and between the increasingly urgent and then anguished private correspondence included in the bundle, letters from the railway company's superintendent, from the police agent, from a medical man who had been present, was this. On the night of the 14th of October, 1871, a group of 17 witnesses being transported through Whitechapel Cross had been ambushed. By whom, the records did not clearly state. The descriptions in the private letters were fragmentary, contradictory, written by people who were clearly in a state of extreme distress. One letter spoke of a figure known to the police but never apprehended, the man we have called the inspector, for he presents himself as such. Another spoke of a darkness that came in through the tunnel before the train arrived, ahead of it as a herald. The medical man wrote of injuries that he described as consistent with sharp-edged instruments wielded with great expertise and equally great malice, which was, Edmund thought, the most clinical possible way to describe what had happened to those 17 people. How many had survived the incident was not clearly stated. The records implied very few. The investigation that followed, conducted by the same Metropolitan Police who had been using the station, had concluded inconclusively. The inspector, whoever or whatever he was, had vanished. The station had been closed. The records had been sequestered. The Metropolitan Board of Works had sealed the tunnel entrances at both ends. The Underground City and South London Railway had quietly ceased to trade, its directors dispersed, its employees sworn to silence under pain of losing their pensions. And in 1871, 17 people had been left in a tunnel beneath Whitechapel, left, the records implied, in a manner that made their ordinary recovery impossible. The nature of what was done to the transported persons, the police agent had written in his final report, in the tight controlled handwriting of a man who has seen too much, and is trying very hard not to say all of it, makes it inadvisable to attempt retrieval of that is, the situation in the tunnel must be regarded as, we are advised by those with knowledge of these matters that the transported persons should be considered as remaining in the station, in some capacity not fully understood by your petitioner, and that disturbance of the station is to be avoided, as it may prove both fruitless and additionally harmful. Edmund set down the letter. He sat in the basement room in the lamplight and let the weight of it settle onto him. 17 people, left in the station in some capacity not fully understood, for 18 years. He thought about the voices he had heard through the compartment walls, the face at the glass partition, the hand pressed flat against the barrier. He thought, they are not dead. They are not alive. They are on the train, and the train runs on the same tracks it has always run, and it arrives at 12:07 because 12:07 was when the ambush began. And the clock has not moved because the clock is not, in the ordinary sense, measuring time. It is marking a moment that has not ended. He thought, and every night the train surfaces, draws other passengers in, brings them through the station, and then returns. He thought, who is the inspector? What is the inspector? He thought, and is there any way to end this? Chapter 7. The Passenger List. There was, folded inside the back of the second ledger in the bundle, a passenger list. It was a single sheet of paper, folded 4 times, its edges soft with handling. Edmund unfolded it carefully. It was a handwritten list, names in 2 columns, with dates beside each name, and in a 3rd column, a brief notation that ranged from arrived safely to arrived distressed to, for 5 of the entries near the bottom of the list, simply did not arrive. He read through the names slowly. He did not recognize most of them. They were ordinary Victorian names, the names of working people: Thomas H., laborer; Mrs. E. Barton, seamstress; William J. Cross, night watchman. But as he read further, certain names began to generate an uncomfortable recognition. Harriet Voss. He had found her name in the missing persons records. She appeared on this list with a date of October 14, 1871, and the notation, did not arrive. There were 4 others who had not arrived. 4 who had been on the train on the 14th of October, the night of the ambush, and had not come out the other side. And then Edmund's eye reached the bottom of the list, below the October entries, and he stopped breathing for a moment. The last entry on the list was not from 1871. It was from 1862. The name was Thomas E. Blackwood, private inquiry agent, former Metropolitan Police. And beside it in the 3rd column, arrived safely, then crossed out and rewritten, unknown. Edmund stared at the name for a long time. Thomas Blackwood. Thomas Edward Blackwood, who had been Edmund's father, who had worked for 22 years as a Metropolitan Police detective, and then retired to conduct private inquiries, and who had disappeared in the winter of 1862 when Edmund was 11 years old, and whose disappearance had never been explained, not in 27 years of his son's looking, not in 17 years of the son becoming, himself, a detective and searching with every professional tool at his disposal. Edmund sat very still in the basement room and felt the particular cold of a revelation that changes the shape of everything. His father had been transported through Whitechapel cross station. In 1862, 9 years before the ambush on the 14th of October. Whatever had happened on the 14th of October 1871 had happened to 17 people, but his father had come through in 1862, 9 years earlier, and the notation said, arrived safely, crossed out and rewritten as unknown, which meant someone had originally believed Thomas Blackwood had survived the journey and then had subsequently become uncertain. He thought, what was his father investigating in 1862? He thought there were Whitechapel murders before the ones in 1871, the disturbances, and before those in the 1860s there had been other disturbances. He had read about them in the course of his Ripper investigation as historical background. Women disappearing, the particular geography of violence that clustered around the Whitechapel district like iron filings around a lodestone. He thought, my father was looking into the same thing I have been looking into, and my father ended up on this list, transported through a secret station and then unknown. He spent a long time sitting in the lamplight with the passenger list in his hands, and then he folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in his coat pocket alongside the letter he had already taken, and he left the basement and walked into the bright, ordinary afternoon of London. He had always believed, in a vague and unexamined way, that his father had simply left, had found the family insufficient, had walked out one winter morning and not come back. It was the story Edmund's mother had told in the years before she too died, a quiet, dignified story that said nothing and explained nothing. Edmund had half believed it and half not believed it for 27 years. His father had not simply left. His father had been looking for the same shadow Edmund had been pursuing, and the shadow had, what? Taken him. As it had taken the 17 on the 14th of October, as it had taken the faces behind the glass in the train's compartments. Edmund walked back toward Whitechapel and he thought, I am not going to let this go. I was never going to let this go, but now I understand why. Chapter 8, The Clock That Never Moves. He found Miss Grey again on the 16th night. She had not been among the passengers on any intervening night, or if she had slipped away before Edmund could speak with her. He had been looking for her, conscious that she represented something different from the other arrivals, a person who had arrived with purpose, with preparation, with a suitcase of evidence assembled over years. A person who was, in some sense, working on the same investigation. She came out of the second carriage from the front, suitcase in hand, and this time when she stepped onto the platform she looked directly at him, as if she had expected to find him there. You are still here, she said. I am still here, Edmund agreed, and I have learned a great deal since we last spoke. She looked at him with the gray eyes that had stayed in his mind over the intervening nights, sharp and watchful. Tell me, she said. He told her. All of it, the sequestered records, the ambush of October 1871, the 17 witnesses, the passenger list, his father's name at the bottom. He watched her face as he spoke, and she listened with an attention that was complete and focused, asking no questions until he had finished. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Your father's name, when was his entry dated? 1862. She looked at the suitcase in her hand. She set it down on the platform and opened it and began to work through the layers of newspapers with practiced efficiency, pulling out papers from the lower strata from the early 1860s. She spread 3 of them on the bench, the Times, twice, and the Evening Standard, and Edmund held his lamp close and read the headlines. Mystery of the Whitechapel woman. East London outrage, police baffled. The inspector, who is the figure seen NEAR scene of Whitechapel crimes. The inspector, Edmund said. He appears in reports going back to 1856, Miss Grey said. Every time there are disappearances or killings in this particular area of Whitechapel, he is described consistently. Very tall, long black coat, tall hat. He never speaks to witnesses. He is never apprehended. He is never identified. She paused. And after each series of incidents he disappears only to appear again years later when the killings begin again. Edmund thought about the figure at the end of the platform, the absolute stillness, the darkness around it. He was here on the 14th of October, 1871, Edmund said. The letters called him the inspector. They said he was known to the police but never apprehended. And he was here in 1888, Miss Grey said quietly. Is here, in some sense, she looked at him. The Ripper, Mr. Blackwood. Edmund had thought it. He had not quite allowed himself to say it. The Ripper killings had a particular surgical quality, he said carefully. Expertise and great malice, she said. Your words, from the 1871 records. Yes. They looked at each other across the lamplight, and the clock on the wall showed 12:07, and the platform was silent around them. The clock, Edmund said. He walked to it. It was a large clock, iron-framed, mounted on the tile wall beside the entrance to one of the side corridors. Up close, he could see that it was not a simple stopped clock. The mechanism was intact. He could see the pendulum through a small glass aperture in the case, and it was moving. It was swinging. The clock was running. The hands were moving. They were moving backwards. Not quickly, not visibly, in the way that a backwards-running clock seems to move backwards when you watch it, almost imperceptibly slowly. He watched the second hand complete what should have been a forward sweep and confirmed. Backward. The clock was running backward, and because it ran backward at the same rate it would normally run forward, it appeared to a glance to stand still. "It's running backward," he said. Miss Gray had come to stand beside him. She looked at the clock with an expression Edmund could not read. "Since the 14th of October, 1871, she said. "If it started at 12:07 and has been running backward since then, since the moment of the ambush, it would, over the course of 18 years, have moved," she calculated silently, "far enough backward that it would complete an enormous number of revolutions and return to 12:07 many times. And a backward-running clock is indistinguishable from a stopped one, to anyone who isn't watching carefully." "Unless they are," Edmund said. "Unless they are." He looked at the pendulum. Backward, patient. 18 years of backward motion. Going where? What did a clock measure when it ran in reverse? Time was supposed to move in one direction only, forward, into causes becoming effects, into consequences flowering from actions. A clock running backward was measuring something that was not, in the ordinary sense, time. He thought, the station is not in ordinary time. The train is not running on ordinary tracks through ordinary tunnels. The people in the compartments are not passengers in the ordinary sense. He thought, the 14th of October, 1871 has not ended. Here, in this station beneath Whitechapel, it has not ended. He thought, and the inspector, the figure in the black coat. He has been here since before the train. He will be here after. He turned to Miss Gray. "Who sent you?" he asked, and the question was direct and deliberate, and she heard the directness in it. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful and precise. "I was a journalist," she said. "I wrote for a women's paper nothing you would have read, and I was researching the Ripper killings in 1888, and the research led me here to this district, to this history, and I found," she paused, "I found evidence that the Ripper was not a new phenomenon, that whoever or whatever was doing this had done it before, many times over many decades. And I began to collect the evidence. And then one evening I was on a train, and I was thinking about what I had found, and there was a tunnel, and—" She stopped. "And you have been on the midnight train since," Edmund said. "I believe so." She said it quietly, with a composure that Edmund suspected cost her a great deal. "I believe I have been on it for some time. I believe that when I arrive on the platform each night I am briefly here, in 1889, in your present, and then—" "And then you return," Edmund said. "Yes." He understood now what she had meant when she had said she was uncertain about her past tense. He said, "I am going to find a way to end this. I am going to find out what happened on the 14th of October, 1871. What really happened, all of it, and I am going to find the inspector, and I am going to—" He stopped, because he was making a promise he did not yet know how to keep. "I will end it," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I believe you. That is why I kept the evidence. I was keeping it for someone who would come and use it." She paused. "I think you are that person." The train arrived. She picked up her suitcase. She looked at him one more time. 12:07, she said. "That is the moment it began. That is the moment you need to find your way back to." She turned and stepped through the carriage door. "The clock runs backward. Perhaps that is a map." The doors closed. The train was gone. Edmund looked at the clock, backward, patient, measuring something he was only beginning to understand. Chapter 9: The Final Journey. The fog on the evening of the 22nd night was unlike anything Edmund had seen in a winter of exceptional fogs. He stepped from his rooms on Lemon Street at 10 o'clock and was immediately swallowed. The ordinary London particular, yellow, sulphurous, reducing visibility to a few feet, had been replaced by something denser and grayer and more complete. The gas lamps were invisible beyond 10 yards. The sounds of the city had been muffled to something that felt, pressing in from all sides, less like quiet and more like the active suppression of sound, as if the fog were absorbing noise, digesting it. Edmund could hear his own footsteps on the cobblestones, and almost nothing else. He walked by memory and compass instinct, counting streets, feeling his way along walls. He arrived at the iron door in the railway arch at 10:40 and descended immediately. On the platform, the air was if possible colder than usual, and the faint lights in the decorative brackets on the walls were burning lower than he had ever seen them, a thin blue-white that barely threw shadows. He sat on the bench and waited, and the clock showed 12:07, and the darkness in the tunnel mouths was absolute. He had spent the previous 6 days in preparation. He had reread every document in his possession, the letters from the basement of Spring Gardens, the passenger list, his own notes from 22 nights of observation, and he had constructed a theory that was, as theories went, either very good or completely mad. He had also visited, cautiously and with considerable effort, a very old woman in Spitalfields who had been recommended to him by the elderly railway employee as someone with unusual knowledge of the area's history, someone who had been in the district in the 1870s, who had been tangentially connected to the police investigation of the Whitechapel disturbances, and who was still, incredibly, alive at what she claimed was 87 years of age. Her name was Agnes Cork, and she had lived in the same rooms above a chandler's shop on Brick Lane for 60 years, and she was small and very still, and her eyes were like chips of pale stone in her ancient face, and she had looked at Edmund when he appeared at her door and said, before he could speak, "I wondered when one of you would come." He had spent 4 hours with her. She had been a young woman in 1871, 19, working as a seamstress, living on Fashion Street. She had known 2 of the 17 witnesses transported through Whitechapel Cross on the night of October 14th. She had been at the underground station entrance, waiting for them when the horror had begun. She described it in flat, factual terms, in the way people describe terrible things they have had 60 years to make peace with. The train had arrived at 12:07. The witnesses had been emerging from the carriages, and then a figure had come out of the far tunnel, not from either of the ordinary directions, but from a third tunnel mouth that was not on any plan of the station, a tunnel that she had never seen open before or since that night. A tall figure in a long black coat. He moved through the station, she said, and the lights went out as he moved, not all at once, in sequence like he was carrying the dark with him. She was quiet for a moment. They screamed, the people on the platform, and then they didn't scream anymore, and then it was very quiet. Another pause, and then the train left, and he was gone. And I was alone on the stairs, and I was too frightened to go down and look. And in the morning the Board of Works men came and sealed it, and I never went back. Edmund had asked the question that had been building in him for 3 weeks. Who was he? What was he? Agnes Cork had looked at him with her pale stone eyes. He is the station, she said. He is what the station is for. The station was built to collect things, to receive them, to keep them. The railway company didn't know that. They thought they built it for their own purposes, but something was here long before them, and it used what they built for what it had always needed. She paused. He has been here since the city was here, perhaps longer. He wears whatever clothes the era provides. He calls himself whatever the era calls such figures. In my mother's time they called him the peeler. Before that, the watch. He is the inspector because we live in an age of inspectors, and the name is a kind of joke he is making, I think. A very old joke. What does he want? Edmund had asked. Agnes Cork had looked at him for a long time. Company, she had said finally. He wants company. The station collects people who are looking, detectives, journalists, investigators, witnesses, anyone who comes too close to what he is, and he keeps them. In the station, on the train, in the dark. She had looked at the tea in her cup. Your father was one of them. Edmund had sat very still. Thomas Blackwood, she said. I knew him, he was a good man. He found the station and went in, and he found it too late to leave. She paused. The ones who go in after 12:07, they can still leave, usually if they are careful. But your father stayed too long, and the 12:07 came around, and she stopped. He is on the train, she said gently. He has been on the train for 27 years. This was what Edmund carried down to the platform on the 22nd night. This was what he sat with in the cold and the silence, the blue-white light barely touching the darkness. His father had been on the train for 27 years. The people in the compartments, the voices, the faces at the glass partitions, his father was among them. His father had been looking for the same thing Edmund had spent his career looking for, and had found it and had been kept. The vibration began at 11:58. Stronger than usual, the benches rattling, the brackets in the walls trembling, dust sifting down from the ceiling. The clock showed 12:07 with its backward hands, patient and precise. The train emerged at 12:07. But tonight it was different. Tonight there were no passengers disembarking. The doors of the carriages opened as always and remained open as always, and the platform remained empty. No confused Victorians stepping out into the cold. No bewildered faces with ancient travel and modern terror in their eyes. The train was full. Every compartment window showed faces, more faces than Edmund had ever seen, pressed against the glass on both sides, looking out at the platform with the combined weight of years and years of accumulated looking. He could see them clearly in the pale lights, dozens of faces, scores of faces, every one of them watching him. And in the window of the third compartment from the front, a man with Edmund's own jaw and Edmund's own brow and Edmund's own gray eyes, older than Edmund had ever known him, much older, the face of a man who has aged in a place without days or seasons, pressed his hand against the glass. Edmund walked to the carriage. He stopped in front of the window. He looked at his father's face. His father's mouth moved. Edmund, trained by 17 years and the particular attention of a man who has had to understand what people could not say aloud, read the words, not you too. Edmund shook his head. He had not come to be kept. He had come to finish it. Chapter 10, The Last Passenger. The inspector was standing at the far end of the platform. Edmund had expected this. He turned from the carriage window and looked the length of the platform, and there the figure was, the long black coat, the tall hat, the stillness that was the opposite of ordinary human stillness. Not frozen, but permanent. The stillness of something that does not move because it does not need to, because everything eventually comes to it. Edmund walked toward it. He was aware, as he walked, of the train behind him and the faces in the windows, and his father's hand pressed against the glass. He was aware of the clock on the wall, ticking backward, and of the fog pressing down through 40 feet of London above him. He was aware of all 22 nights of accumulated knowledge, and all 17 years of detective work, and all 27 years of looking for his father and not finding him. And he was aware that these things had been converging toward this moment since the night he had first descended the stone stairs with his lamp. He stopped 10 feet from the figure. Up close for the first time he could see it clearly. The face under the hat's brim was a face, not a void, not a supernatural absence of features, but a face. It was a man's face, or it was something that had spent so long inhabiting the shape of a man's face that the distinction had become academic. It was old, very old, in the way that stone weathers and iron rusts, in the way that things have aged without having had youth. The eyes were pale and completely still, and they looked at Edmund with an expression that he recognized, after a moment, as the expression Agnes Cork had named. Curiosity, hunger, the particular appetite of something that collects. "You have been here a long time," Edmund said. The inspector did not speak, but something in the stillness shifted, a slight inclination of the head, an acknowledgement. "You were here before this station, you will be here after," Edmund paused. "And you have been using this place, this fixed point, this moment that hasn't ended as a means of keeping people who came close to finding you." He thought of his father, he thought of Miss Gray, he thought of the 17 on the 14th of October. They weren't killed. You kept them because you are not a killer, not precisely. You are something else. The inspector was very still. "You are a collector," Edmund said, "and what you collect is attention. People who pay attention to what you are and where you are and what you do. You take them. You keep them in the train, in the station, in the moment, because that is what the station was always for, not the railway company's purposes. Yours, a place to keep what you collect, the ones who look too closely. He reached into his coat pocket. He withdrew the passenger list, his father's name at the bottom, crossed out and rewritten, unknown. He held it up so that the inspector could see it. My father, 27 years, Miss Gray, others across the decades, and the 17 who never arrived who have been here since 1871. He met the pale eyes directly. I am going to offer you a trade. He was not entirely certain this would work. Agnes Cork had given him the theory, cautiously, with many qualifications. But she had lived in this district for 60 years, and she had studied what she had seen on the night of October 14th more carefully than anyone else alive, and she had told him what she believed, that the inspector's power was rooted in the station, in the moment, in the fixity of 12/7. That a backward-running clock was going backward toward something, toward the moment before the moment, the breath before the catastrophe, and that if the clock were permitted to reach its destination. The clock has been running backward for 18 years, Edmund said. It is almost there, isn't it? Almost back to the moment before 12/7, before the ambush, before you came through that third tunnel mouth with the dark around you like a garment. He paused. What happens when the clock runs all the way back? I think you don't know. I think even you don't know what happens when the moment before the moment arrives. The inspector's stillness changed quality. It was the same complete immobility, but there was something in it now that Edmund could not name. Something that might, in a human face, have been uncertainty. Let them go, Edmund said. All of them, the ones on the train, the 17, my father, Miss Gray. Release them from the station from the moment. Let 12/7 end. He kept his eyes on the pale gaze, steady and direct, the way he had looked at murderers across interrogation tables, the way he had looked at the worst things he had seen and had not looked away. And I will stay. I will be your last passenger, the one who solved the case, the one who found you, the attention you want most. I will stay in this station, and you will let the others go. The silence that followed this was enormous. The lamp in his hand burned steadily, amber and warm. Behind him, the train sat on its rails, patient and black. The clock on the wall ticked backward, almost to the moment before the moment. The inspector looked at him. In those pale eyes, something very old and very hungry considered the offer. And then something else happened, something Edmund had not anticipated and could not have planned. The clock on the wall reached its destination. It reached the moment before the moment, the second before 12/7 on the 14th of October, 1871, the breath before the catastrophe. The clock stopped. Not the backward stop of 18 years of reversed motion. A genuine stop. A final stop. The pendulum swung once more and did not swing back, and the ticking ceased, and in the silence that followed there was a quality that Edmund had never heard before and would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. A quality of something enormous releasing its tension, of a cord held taut for a very long time being finally cut. The lights in the carriage windows blazed for a fraction of a second, blindingly bright, and then went out. All of them, every lamp in the station, Edmund's own lamp, total darkness. In the darkness, sounds. The sounds of the train, carriages, doors, mechanisms, and then, improbably, incredibly, footsteps. Not one pair, many, the sound of many people beginning to move. Edmund stood in the dark with his arms at his sides and his heart very loud in his chest, and he heard them moving past him, not jostling him, not touching him, but present, close, the movement of air against his face that accompanies the passage of bodies in a confined space. He could not see anything. He could hear breathing and movement and the quiet sounds of people who have been somewhere terrible for a very long time and have just been told they can leave. One pair of footsteps stopped beside him. A hand found his arm in the darkness. A strong grip, slightly trembling, the grip of a man who had not gripped anything in a very long time but had not forgotten how. Edmund. The voice was low, roughened by years of disuse, but he knew it. He had heard it only in very early memory, in the way you hear things that lodge themselves in childhood, not clearly but with the certainty of the body's knowledge. "Father," Edmund said. They stood together in the dark for a moment that was too long and not long enough, and then the hand released his arm and the footsteps continued toward the stairs, and Edmund heard his father climbing up through the dark toward the surface, toward Whitechapel and the fog and the ordinary night. Edmund stood alone on the platform. He waited. He did not know what he was waiting for, perhaps for the inspector to fulfill his side of the bargain he had not exactly agreed to, perhaps for something worse. The darkness was complete and the silence was absolute, and he could not tell from where he stood whether there was anything left in the station with him. He struck a match. Its small flame was almost a shock after the total dark. He held it up. The platform was empty. The tracks were empty. The tunnel mouths were dark in the ordinary way of tunnels, the darkness of enclosed spaces in the absence of light, nothing more and nothing less. The inspector was gone. Edmund lit his lamp from the match and stood in its circle of amber light and made himself breathe steadily for a full minute before moving. He checked his notebook. He checked his watch. It was reading normally, the hands moving forward in the correct direction. It was 12:28. He walked to where the clock hung on the wall. It showed he had to look twice, 12:07, but the pendulum was still. The clock was not running backward. It was not running at all. It had simply, finally stopped, and its stopped face showed the moment it had been measuring for 18 years. A stopped clock, Edmund thought, showing 12:07. Twice a day now, like any stopped clock, it would be correct. He climbed the stairs for the last time. He emerged into the London fog and looked up at the arch above him. He found the iron door behind him and pulled it closed and heard the old lock catch. He stood on Commercial Street in the cold and the damp and breathed the air of an ordinary London winter night. Coal smoke and river mud and bakery somewhere nearby, the animal warmth of the city, and he thought about endings. About things that have not ended, finally ending. Epilogue after the fog. Thomas Blackwood reappeared in the official record on the morning of March 7, 1889, when a constable on Commercial Street found an elderly man sitting on the pavement in the pre-dawn hours, confused and very cold but physically unharmed, wearing clothing that the constable noted in his report as being of an old-fashioned cut, rather the worse for wear. Thomas gave his name. He gave his address, Lemon Street, though the house number was decades out of date, and he gave his son's name. Edmund was notified. He collected his father from the workhouse infirmary where the constable had taken him and brought him home. The recovery was slow. Thomas Blackwood had been, in some sense, nowhere for 27 years, and the return to ordinary London time was not immediate. He spoke little about what he had experienced. He was prone to standing very still in rooms and looking at corners and empty spaces, and his son learned not to ask what he saw there, or perhaps did not see, was checking to confirm was not there. He lived for 11 more years, dying in 1900 at the age of 83. In his final years, he resumed, in a small way, his old work as a private inquiry agent. He was very good at finding people who did not want to be found. The others who had been on the train also returned. They returned confused and in poor health and with large gaps in their chronological understanding, but they returned. Agnes Cork, who had not expected to see any of them in her lifetime, was found by Edmund standing at her door in Brick Lane in the grey light of the same morning, looking at the people walking slowly up from the direction of Whitechapel with an expression on her ancient face that Edmund had never seen before and did not have words for. "How many?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Edmund said. "Many." She nodded slowly, and him. Edmund thought about the empty platform, the still pendulum. "Gone," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, for now. He wanted to argue with her. He had the detective's instinct toward closed cases, toward the satisfying seal of a conclusion. But he was also a detective who had spent 17 years on a case that refused to be closed, and he knew something about the difference between gone and finished. For now, he agreed. He never found Miss Gray. She was not among those who returned from the station in the aftermath. He searched carefully, methodically, using every tool he had. He found no record of her that he could trace to a person still living. The suitcase of newspapers was left behind on the platform on the night of the 22nd. He had brought it up with him when he finally left. It sat in his rooms on Lemon Street for a long time, then moved with him when he eventually moved. He kept it because it was evidence, and because she had spent what might have been years collecting it, and it deserved to be kept. He wrote up everything he knew eventually, not for publication, not in a form intended for official eyes, but as a record. A long, careful, truthful account of what he had found beneath Whitechapel, what it had meant, what it had cost. He wrote about his father and about Miss Gray and about the 17 and about the inspector, and he tried to be precise about what he did not know and honest about what he did, and when he was finished, he read it through once and put it in a locked box. He found, as the months passed, that he was asked occasionally about the Jack the Ripper investigation. People knew he had been connected to it. The press had reported his involvement in 1888, and the case remained, for the public, one of the great unsolved mysteries of the age. He was asked, at dinner parties and in newspaper columns, whether he believed the killer had ever been identified, whether Scotland Yard had known more than it had released, whether there was a satisfying answer. He always said the same thing. He believed the answer was more complicated than any single answer could contain. He believed the Ripper, if one could call it that, if one could name it with a word that applied to ordinary human malice, had never been a single man, had never been a man at all, in any sense that the word usually conveyed. He believed it had been here long before the killings, in 1888. He believed the killings in 1888 had been, as the killings in 1871 had been, as the killings in the 1860s had been, as the disappearances and violences going back into the historical record of the district as far as the record went. He believed they had all been expressions of the same presence, the same appetite, the same immense and patient hunger for the particular kind of attention paid by people who look closely and ask questions and do not look away. He believed that the station beneath Whitechapel had not simply been built. He believed it had been arranged, by what means, through what channels, he could not precisely say, to serve a function that had nothing to do with the transportation of the London laboring classes between their homes and their workplaces. He believed the clock on its wall had been measuring something for 18 years that he did not have the mathematics to describe. And he believed most firmly, with the conviction of a man who has looked at something terrible and looked back at the world and found the world continuing regardless, that it was not over, that presences like the one he had encountered beneath Whitechapel did not end. They receded. They waited. They wore whatever clothes the era provided and called themselves whatever the era called such figures, and eventually, after enough years had passed for the city to relax its guard, for the records to be buried again under fresh layers of bureaucratic sediment, for the people who knew to die and take their knowing with them, they returned. In 1889, Edmund Blackwood had been 40 years old and certain that he had seen the worst the world could show him. By 1900, the year his father died, he was 51 and certain of very little, which he considered an improvement. He had learned in the decade between to hold certainty more lightly, to understand that solved cases and finished things were often the same case, and the same thing under a different face, bidding its time in a locked room in a basement of a building that nobody important remembered. There were still reports of a figure in a long black coat in the streets around Whitechapel. They appeared occasionally in the newspapers, brief items, usually in the miscellany columns, quickly forgotten. Edmund kept them in a file. He kept everything. The iron door in the railway arch on Commercial Street had been sealed over with new brickwork by the county council in the autumn of 1889, as part of a general program of infrastructure repair. Edmund had watched them do it. He had told himself that this was good, that the sealing of the entrance was a reasonable precaution. He knew, with the certainty of a man who has walked down those stairs 22 times, that brickwork would not be the decisive factor. Some stations cannot be closed. Some trains cannot be stopped. And some passengers, the ones who look too closely, who ask the right questions, who stand at the edge of a platform in the dark and hold their lamp steady and refuse to look away, some passengers are already, in the deepest sense, boarded. The only question is whether the train will let them off. And London, 1889, 1900. The clock runs backward, the train runs on, Whitechapel waits.